So welcome back to the Content Theatre. So by way of a change from some of the content we've heard today, we're now going to be running a panel. So I'll pass you over and the guys will introduce themselves and we'll get cracking.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming. We've got the lunchtime slot here, so well done everyone for their loyalty. I'm not sure we're serving sandwiches, but perhaps we might be, you never know. My name is Ben Smith. I'm the founder of an online PR magazine called prmoment.com. Now, normally I spend my time talking to public relations people, but I suspect, bearing in mind the title of the show, we've got a slightly different audience today. So could we just have a quick show of hands? Who here works in PR or would define themselves as working in PR? Okay, that's fascinating. And then should we go marketing? Who works in marketing? Okay, brilliant. Okay, so the majority of marketing professional people here. On the panel today, we have an eclectic bunch. We've got Brian Ahern, who is the founder of Parker Wayne & Kent Public Relations. John Bernstein, who comes with the journalistic perspective on things. John used to be a journalist at New Statesman and Channel 4, and is now a digital marketing strategist. And finally, the chap in the red, he's always wearing red as far as I can tell, is Adam Cranfield, who's marketing director at My News Desk. I thought it might be interesting just to put this debate into some perspective, so we'll get a couple of thoughts from each of the panellists, and then I've got some questions, some proper nasty questions, and we'll certainly open it up to the floor. So let's try and make this a nice informal, interactive session. But chaps, if we could have a couple of thoughts from you on the subject of how people can communicate digitally with journalists.
Thanks, Ben. Yes, well, we're going to cover a lot of different topics in this debate, I'm sure, but I would say that what I'm seeing in working for My News Desk, providing a brand newsroom and digital PR platform, is that the way that people are working with journalists is changing a lot. So I did a presentation myself here yesterday where I talked about the first ever press release back in 1906, which was published verbatim in the New York Times after the Atlantic City Railroad disaster. And we've come a long way since the days when a press release is just simply what's published. So the way that brands engage with journalists has changed a lot. My News Desk has been around for 10 years and aimed to provide a better way for brands to communicate with journalists. Today, 10 years on, our product and our platform is much more about providing a way of for brands to use content in general. So telling stories to all kinds of audiences online. So there's a lot of changes. We're going to go into, I'm sure, what's happening with things like newswires and media databases and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of the things that were best practice with SEO as well have changed a lot in recent years. So it's going to be an interesting debate, I think.
So Ben, you asked for some context, and speaking as a journalist on the panel, I think you talked about it's about attaining attention and attaining coverage, and it's digital strategies and tools. And if you forgive me, I'll put the tools to one side and talk about strategies in the digital world. And I think the strategies in the digital world, for my money, a lot of them are the same as the strategies in the analog world. So they are about understanding the publication, they are about understanding the journalist's needs, they are about thinking like a journalist, they are about telling, as Adam says, about telling stories and telling compelling stories. They're about making use of the diary, the editorial calendar, but they're also about being able to react to breaking news and being able to recognize what's on the news agenda. And these news cycles, because of social media in some respects, is getting faster and faster. So those are the things that are the same as they ever were. They're the same as they were in the analog world. I think there are a few things, maybe three things that have changed as a result of the digital world. And they are around working patterns. Deadlines are much more fluid when the journalists are working online. The deadlines come all the time. Do you understand when those deadlines are? Do you understand when the critical time is to be communicating with a journalist? If you don't, you need to find that out. And it's also about changing consumption habits. The readers are changing when they read, what they read. And in large part, those consumption habits are changing because of smart devices, because of mobile smartphones and tablets, and that means that the time of day when people are consuming is changing, the day of the week that people are consuming is changing, and smart newsrooms, smart editorial teams will adapt to that, and as a result you need to adapt in turn. You need to understand how they are working because of those changing consumer habits, consumption habits, and adapt yourself. And the final point that I would make on this, my final observation, is actually sometimes it's quite wise to bypass the journalist in order to get media attention. Now, I appreciate that sounds completely perverse, it sounds utterly counterintuitive, but I think within that there is a nugget of truth, there is an element of realism. And I'll give you one, maybe two examples, we've got time. So, I mean, I think the John Lewis Christmas ad is a very good example of, in a sense, bypassing in order to get attention. So now, habitually, that Christmas ad goes on social media, and it gets a buzz, and it gets shared. I mean, this is remarkable. An ad is being passed around by the people that are viewing it. That's fantastic. And in a sense, it's bypassing the journalist, and as a result, getting much more attention. So that's one example. And if you'll forgive me, I'll just give you one final example of where I think bypassing the journalist to gain attention, and it's close to my heart because it involved the New Statesman, and it involved a story that we ran a couple of years ago that was written by the actor Hugh Grant, bizarrely. And the actor Hugh Grant went undercover with a wire and recorded a conversation he had with a former News of the World journalist. And that conversation was about phone hacking, as you might imagine, something that's very close to Hugh Grant's heart. And the conversation was fascinating, and it involved lots of celebrities and lots of politicians and members of the royal family, etc., etc. Great story. The lawyers let us run it. Remarkably, we ran the story, and before we put it out to print, we tried to do our own PR. We tried to do our own marketing of this story. We gave it to a national newspaper. That national newspaper, in their wisdom, ran the story on page 8, buried 200 words in a box. We were disappointed. We were slightly bemused. We thought it was a great story, and we started to question ourselves, is this really a very good story after all? But a week later, we put this story out on the web. We used social media to disseminate this story, and lo and behold, it went viral, and it went around the world. And when it finished going around the world, it went around the world a second time. And as a result of all that, the mainstream media started covering the story. So in a sense, by accident rather than design in that instance, we bypassed the journalist in order to gain attention.
There's a variety of things which you could do on this subject, is talk about specific tools, and there's a million apps sort of launching and lots of different technologies which are out there. Adam mentioned Newswires, which I'm sure some of you like, PR Newswire and that kind of stuff, which people will use as a way that they believe is going to be communicating with journalists digitally, in essence. We'll probably come back to those sorts of things. And of course there's email and Twitter, and we've launched our own kind of method for using Twitter for people in particular verticals. If you go to hacktweets.com, you'll see a variety of lists where actually you can look at journalists by their verticals and their Twitter handles, things. So there's a variety of things like that out there. But actually I want to echo and also naturally challenge some of the things John has actually said there. Communicating digitally with journalists does start from a strategic decision, and that goes into actually what is the content you're creating, what the actual story is. It's not just about how relevant it is, it's how well it's written. Does it actually get to the point? Is it really, first off, is it news? And I think we're in the content marketing theatre, and content marketing is great, and we kind of, the John Lewis example is a great example of content marketing. But you know what? They had millions of pounds of budget. I've heard £7 million or something like that. So you know what? And they also have a very large organisation. Lots of people use public relations, want to communicate with journalists, so that they use the media title as a platform to get more awareness, and actually doing it for a minimal amount of budget. Even John's example there of the New Statesman doing its own PR, well, you know what, they're a sizable publisher and a respected publisher already with a decent audience, and they're in a better position than lots of brands and companies who don't necessarily have the same sort of current following already. And also to challenge the fact that it was bypassing journalists. In fact, it wasn't. It was an editorial decision whether to run the content provided by the actor. So media relations is still important, but it's about finding making sure your content is created and then how it's presented to journalists. Now, I don't use my news desk, but basically my newsroom, but actually on creating online press offices, I've also been a major advocate of doing that for 13 years. I've been advising people on how to communicate with journalists digitally for 13 years now. And in fact, one of the first things I do advise any company I'm working with is to build an online press office, providing a space online which serves a very crucial, critical audience, which is journalists, who are a platform for you, who, if you communicate with them well and give them good content and don't just overburden them with masses of content, which in this stage of content marketing, there's a lot of dross out there. Journalists don't want that. They need really good, incisive content. Giving them a designated place which they can go and find out as much as they need to about a story so they can do a lot of the work themselves. It's about making a journalist's life as easy as possible. That's the strategy to use when you are communicating with journalists digitally.
Great, thank you. John, I just had a quick question for you. I think it's important to cover this off, isn't it? As a former journalist, what was the most successful way that you found public relations and marketing people communicated with you?
Disappointingly, I'm going to say it depends, because it depended. I mean, it really did. It depended on the situation. But one of the discussions that we were having beforehand was the relevance of the press release. So I'll take that as one example of something that I think some people consider is old school, and if it's not dead, it's a dying way of communicating. Actually, the press release is dead if it's used badly, if it's used to spam people, if it's used untargeted, and it's bland, and it's not telling a compelling story. As you said, Brian, it's telling something that is dressed up as noteworthy but actually isn't, and there is no semblance of an understanding of you as a journalist, indeed as you as a publication. In that circumstance, the press release is dead, and it was a dreadful way of receiving stuff, and most of that stuff got filtered out and went straight in the bin. But a press release used judiciously and in a timely fashion can be absolutely brilliant. So if you are, and I think this is one of the things that certainly the PR people, a trap they fall into. I'm not sure about the marketing people, but I'll throw this out and for you to digest. Is there is a perception that every time you put a press release out, what you're doing is you're telling your own story in the rounds. But actually, what you might be doing is adding to an existing story. And most journalists, most of the times, are writing existing stories. It's either a story that's in the news agenda because it's just broken, or it's day 3 of an ongoing story, or it's a calendar story, it's a diary story, it's an anniversary story, or it's related to some point in the calendar. And what you're looking for from smart people is a piece of insight, an anecdote, a piece of analysis, an opinion. You're looking for a piece of original thinking. And if you can package that up in a press release, so to answer your question, actually the press release can, if used correctly, can be one of the most successful ways of receiving that information.
If I can say
let me just put it in some context. So I think there's a danger, therefore, of pretending this is a hugely complex issue, but there's a few key themes within it. But just on the channel then, for journalists, and this is probably for Brian and Adam, are we still saying that email and Twitter are the most important platforms and channels to communicate with journalists?
Yes, quite a lot of research on this. The journalists prefer email number 1. Twitter is a different kind of animal. They're not necessarily going to use that as their way to make sure that they don't miss anything, but they're going to be monitoring it. Almost all journalists are monitoring it as much as they possibly can throughout the day to look for new ideas, new breaking stories, different angles. Enables you to stay on top of a much wider range of topics than you normally would have been able to. And then, of course, the other one is RSS and all of those kind of readers like Feedly and things like that. So depending on how tech-savvy the journalist is, they will create their own sort of dashboard and their own sort of way that they work every day to make sure that they're not going to miss the things that are most relevant to them.
I just want to say a word on press releases. I mean, what is a press release? Frankly, it's like sending something to a journalist. That could be an email. It could be a written up news article that is placed on an online newsroom with backgrounders, case study, images, videos, all that kind of stuff in one place, which then draws that journalist in to then pick and choose what they want and how they want to build their story. In fact, just to talk to John's point on, you know, the idea that PR people perceive, you know, that their story is just going to be written up as is. Actually, we've done some research into this of PR people, you know, considering what is valuable coverage. And in fact, they actually rank articles where journalists have actually worked with their content and introduced other other commentators and their own research to create an actual article which is more bespoke to their title as vastly more valuable, because it has that perception of third-party endorsement for the publication that's actually producing it. So, you know, press releases, it's, you know, it's just a different form. They have links in, they provide extra information. So that's a really important way of communicating. And actually, email is still really, really key. You know, Twitter does work, but do you know what? There's also going to be a time, if any of you ever pitch the Sun, the important thing the Sun will say is, right, has this gone anywhere else? Because basically, if it has, we don't want it, we're not going to touch it, yeah? I've had a client, when we were pitching the Sun, we were onto a really good story with them, it was likely to get in, the client decided to stick it on a newswire at the same time we were talking to the Sun, it popped up, that coverage died, we got a telling off, sorry I swear a lot and I'm not going to right now, we got telling off from the Consumer Affairs editor from the Sun, because basically if it goes anywhere, they don't want it. Twitter is useful. And, you know, you can tweet journalists about something and give them, again, a link back to information, like a release, a good release which tells a good story. And it's how you write that tweet. And again, using the subject line of an email. If you ever write a subject line of an email to a journalist which just says press release, yeah, you'd be surprised how many people do. Well, you don't deserve coverage. You deserve to be going into their spam folder, yeah, forever. You need to be very pointed, make it relevant, because you know what, you've got, I say, about 15 seconds to get journalists' attention with the amount of dross they get sent, and it needs to be really good and keenly produced, both on Twitter and on email, yeah? Now, Twitter, we're going back to my issue with the Sun, I think there's going to be a point where journalists' use of Twitter, they're going to be like, well, do you know what, it's on Twitter. Why am I going to write about that now? You give me no exclusivity, particularly when there's so much stuff going, and it's so easy for content to be seeded around the web so quickly now. So those are things I'd say.
Can I just
pick up? You sure? Yeah, just wanted to quickly pick up on Twitter and email, and maybe amplify some of the things that Brian said about email for sure. Twitter first. I mean, you posed the question about were they, you know, for me they are two of the key communication channels to get to journalists. In terms of the social networks, Twitter, for my money, is where most journalists are doing their journalism. They might be on other social networks, but they're not doing their journalism on those social networks. They are doing some of their journalism on Twitter. And how are they using it? Well, they're using it in a number of ways. They're using it to crowdsource. They're using it to taste test. They're using it to observe. So a lot of times they're in the background just observing, and related to that, they're using it to research. They're using it to share interesting stuff that is put out there, and of course they're using it to disseminate their own journalism, to push their own journalism out into the public domain. Now, at every stage of that journey, I think there's an opportunity for digital marketeers and for PRs to do something smart, to offer something that is timely, to offer something that is useful. There's also an opportunity for them to offer something that is not timely and something that is not useful, of course, and to really bugger up that relationship. But the opportunity is there with Twitter. Email, the most underrated and misused technology out there for my money. And part of the reason it might be underrated is because it is so misused by so many people, and part of the reason it might be underrated is because it's been around for a long time. It's a old school new media technology, and therefore I think people kind of miss the opportunity there. And really kind of, I guess, to echo exactly what Brian said, for me, there are three things you need to get right with email. Timeliness, relevancy, and then you need to make it pitch perfect. And in basic terms, pitch perfectness is about that subject header, and it's about the first line of the email. I absolutely concur. You've got 15 seconds to grab the attention, lots of stuff coming through. If that subject header doesn't work, and what slightly puzzles me is that a lot of people in the marketing world know very well about how to really tailor newsletters, emails, when they're going out to their publics, when they're going out to to punters, and they A/B test, and they understand that there's a virtuous circle between open rates and click-through rates, and they work on it and they work on it. I think actually you've got to apply some of that learning to your relationships with journalists as well. And then just one final point about email and Twitter. I think there's a symbiotic relationship between these two things, and it kind of answers the Sun question. You're absolutely right. If something is in the public domain, if you give it all away and everyone's got it, then there's no exclusivity, there's no premium on the story. And of course, every journalist understands that, and hopefully every marketer and every PR person understands that. But what you can do if you use social media and email together is you can take those conversations effectively offline. When it gets to that exclusive bit, you can take it out of the public domain. And I think that's a really interesting way that those two technologies work together.
I'm really sorry, if you wouldn't mind, Ben, I just want to just make one follow-up point to, yes, communicating with journalists by email and Twitter, okay, doesn't sound like rocket science, but it's how you do it. But also, if you think a journalist is going to know, no journalist wants to be called. None of them really want to, yeah, because basically they get a load of calls, mostly people pitching them absolute rubbish, frankly. But the thing is, sometimes you do have to follow up, because there is a good story, but you've got to know that it's a good story. If you're selling in, what we call it selling in, is getting on the phone to pitching into a journalist to say, look, you should really write about this because this is important for your readers, it's an interesting issue, helping them work on the angles for themselves. Yeah, if it's just an email, if a well-written, a good pitch, as John says, should get responses, yeah? So actually the amount of time you spend on the phone to journalists should be minimal. But there's going to be a few times where you've got to phone up, because I've had journalists also get in touch with us after we haven't, from time to time, haven't been able to get hold of them on phone, and they're like, what the hell are you doing? Why? I didn't know about this. It's like, well, it's in your email. Well, that's not good enough. They also are reliant on us to give them content. And whilst they do complain sometimes to, loads of journalists will complain about PRs generally. They don't complain about our calls, frankly, because we're pretty nifty on it. But they don't necessarily want to be called, but really sometimes you have to help them out and do that, and follow up that Twitter stuff, follow up the email stuff. But again, it's being pointed and timely.
Just before we leave the sort of channel side of things, and I'm going to come to the floor in a moment for questions, so do start thinking about those, please. Do we think that newswires still have a role here?
Well, not really. Basically, if you're using a newswire and you don't really know where the press release is going, you're not in control. So what are you measuring? It's not how I would want to do PR. So this was actually where my news desk was originally conceived 10 years ago, was that journalists are getting too much spam, irrelevant press releases. They need to be opting in to receive the content that they want on their own terms. So when people are using newswires, I think it kind of died out a few years ago, and then it kind of came back into fashion because people thought it was a way to boost SEO. Is that fair?
I mean, look, man, you want me to start talking about newswires and I will explode, do you know what I mean?
I mean, we're quite challenging on this at my news desk. We basically are sort of very, very anti the newswires, and we believe that people should be investing in the newsroom and the multimedia news releases that will help that email to stand out in the inbox, give all the different assets. But the idea of basically outsourcing your PR work in a sort of completely blind way, and frankly, really winding up thousands of journalists. If anyone's actually reading these newswires at the other end as well, which is another big question, what's actually happening when it goes out on the wire. So not a good strategy in the main. It's more of if it's going to be used at all, if I'm going to stand up for it at all, it'll be more of a kind of filling in type strategy. You wouldn't want to use that as your main way to try and secure proper, valuable coverage.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything?
Yeah, I'll come back, but I want to hear Brian's.
Oh, no, I was being really proud of myself by not getting onto this one. Really.
Well, I'm going to be pragmatic and then allow Brian to explode, because I think we'd all like to watch that. I mean, I think the judgment call you've got to make with newswires, with PR newswires, and I'm struggling to remember when I actually based a story or used any element of a story based on something I got from a PR newswire, so maybe that answers the question in a sense. But
should we say newswires in general?
Newswires in general, yeah. Okay, newswires in general.
And
in a sense,
are available.
Yeah, so my response is, if it gets to places you cannot reach yourself, and of course all of you are representing brands or you work for brands that have their own platforms, if you think it's going to get you reach that you can't otherwise get, then by all means go for it. And the only other thing that I would add on that concept of newswires from a journalist point of view, or from a personal point of view, the things for me that replaced newswires, frankly, were Twitter and using RSS feeds, and so that became the replacement probably about 4 or 5 years ago. Brian?
I'm really proud of myself. I'm sitting here quite quietly and letting her, because I just hate. Now let's be quite different about we need to actually be quite clear, because there's two things. Newswire is actually real newswires. So the Associated Press, and the Press Association, those guys which train journalists, which, lots of news organisations actually take proper feeds of real editorial from, and they pay subscriptions to place that, to fill content. That's one thing, and they are great, and actually you'll see stuff in the Daily Mail or whatever that comes from a newswire, and those stuff, the real newswire, is great. Then there's the press release distribution wires, which, frankly, are just, we never use them. Some of our American clients, they do it as part of whenever they're putting out a release, they'll always do it. And, of course, sometimes, there's some financial services regulation stuff when a company's doing an announcement. They have to make it as broad as possible, so they use those. But actually, in order to get coverage and real coverage, really not. I mean, we've done a lot of research into this actually, and surveyed journalists and how many of them actually use them. They don't. It's press release spam. They've unsubscribed from pretty much all of them. Yeah, and they're expensive, guys. And you can actually try and measure the cost of distributing. Yeah, PR people. As an agency, we're not cheap. You know what I mean? So, but then again, it's better than wasting your money. Yeah, and actually, most of it is press release spam. We've done a survey of PR people as well, and actually looked, 70% of them have used them. 40-odd% said that they get coverage from time to time, but then when we analyse what sort of coverage that is, that's appearing on a place around the web where nobody is going to see it except the people who have set the Google alert for that company name. Yeah, so the newswires will come back to you and say, hey, look, we got you in Reuters and we got you on Yahoo. No, you didn't. And it will disappear real quickly. And nobody has ever seen that. It's not real coverage. What you want to be is a good quality publication, or a publication that targets your specific audience. And it's good content, again, that you need to do. And of course, if you stick a story that's going out to every news outlet in the world, yeah, and you're doing that scattergun approach, you're absolutely giving no value to that journalist. You're not helping them do their job. Make the journalist's life as easy as possible, give them something valuable, and you'll get paid back by getting coverage. I mean, the great thing about doing PR, you're getting into the content. Nobody reads the papers for the adverts. You want to get into that content. You give the journalist something good and don't give it to everybody. That's the way to go about doing it.
Okay, great. I want to do one question on content, and guys, we're really using up the time, so try and make your answers short and sweet, if I may, because I do want to come to the audience for some questions. In your experience, guys, what content works for journalists?
Yeah, from my point of view, I'm not sure if this gets directly to the question, but the content that works for journalists is from brands, is content that helps tell a story. And this is kind of touched on the point that I was making earlier. That if you can help tell a story, and it's I think it's in the main, it's stories that you are working on, interests that you have, and that requires of the person that is pushing this stuff out a real understanding of who you are, what your peccadillos are, what your interests are, what your angles are, what your agenda is, what your publication is. But if you can help people tell stories with nuggets of information and insight and comment, then that's the content that really helps.
Absolutely. I think that so many press releases you see are not written from the perspective of what is the wider story. They're just too self-centered and thinking about the company itself. That's not a story. So I totally agree that if you understand what the journalist or the blogger is writing about generally, and how does your company or organisation fit into that story, that's the way to think about it, and add something to help them tell a story. I just wanted to mention briefly about the multimedia aspect as well. Increasingly, providing the media assets like video and images is going to make the difference. And we're seeing, and high-res images, we're seeing so many more stories based around a video or an image, and that can make the difference. One example I like to show is when BT Sport went up against Sky Sports when they launched earlier this year. Just looking at a piece of coverage in the Daily Mail, the number of images in that one article, something like 15 images. There was 2 videos. I think there was a stock market chart. There was a quote. There are all these different components, and that's going to make the difference in both whether the journalist uses your story, but also how you come out of that story at the end, because you're not going to hopefully be the only one in that story. But you might be the one with the best image or the best video or the best quote. So think about providing those components.
what does telling a story mean? Beginning, middle, and end? Is it Harry Potter? I don't know whether it is about that. I mean, actually constructing that, and whether they have the time to really go through a story. You know, I know you're a journalist, and that's you know, you'll know what you want, but actually trying to define what that story is quite difficult, because also that involves you with doing some second guessing of what that journalist wants. What we find, and where you're into marketing, you want to sell products and services, yeah? But no journalist wants to write about products and services, right? They don't. You've got a new thing, big deal. There's a load of them out there, right? No one gives them. Journalists don't give them monkeys. And do you know what? Best response for a journalist when you go selling a product-based thing. Of course, it works in certain consumer media. You know, some women's mags, obviously, where there's fashion and beauty stuff. They're there to review products. Okay, no problem. Yeah, there's that. But then there's all the other sorts of media where it's not quite about that. You know, some tech gadget sites, they want to review new products. But actually, for loads of other publications, for most other companies, they don't. Best response a journalist can give you is, you know what? I'll give you the number for the advertising department, yeah, because you're not giving them any editorial, nothing of real worth. Loads of journalists got into the game because they wanted to be significant journalists and have an impact on society. They didn't want to write about your products and services. What they want to do is write about issues. Things that impact the business, industry, society, the world, your street, your locality, what's actually happening. Now, that is your angle. You can use that to leverage, to talk about how your products, services solve, or what they're doing to help in that issue, or whether there's, you know, that issue is part of an ongoing problem that has involved your business. Journalists want to talk about issues, and that's how to leverage good content.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. Any questions from the floor? Yeah, go on. If you say it to me, I'll say it to everyone else. How about that?
Is social media replacing old school PR communication with journalists through PR companies through a long time? Is it replacing it, or will it replace it?
The question is, and I think I get this right, is social media replacing what we used to think of as public relations, because presumably brands can go direct to journalists? Is that what you mean? Or direct? Okay. So is social media replacing the requirement for either media relations professionals or, and therefore, journalists themselves, because brands can just go straight to the consumer? Guys?
I think to a large extent, yes. So I know I'm gonna get a controversial answer back from Brian. I think that there's some fantastic case studies. I was speaking yesterday about the Batkid example. Batkid, hashtag Batkid, which was on the BBC, on CNN, very hard to miss, all the national newspapers. That story would not have been anywhere near as big a story if it had just gone straight to journalists. So that was all done through seeding in social media. In San Francisco, one of the most connected cities in the world, they went out to 500 local bloggers. And those are some of the most connected people. And the first place that I saw this story was on Twitter. I think many people would have first seen it on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. And it was about 1 or 2 days later that it made the national news. So it's not to say that the mainstream media is not vitally important to your coverage, but where you might start could be to create the story and the buzz within a community in social media a lot of the time. And I think a journalist is thinking, is it a good story? That's their own professional judgment. But they're going to be heavily persuaded by what's everyone talking about already. So if you think about half the things that a journalist might... I mean, they're looking at, for example, television, aren't they? Now, what they're writing about is based on how much it's talked about on Twitter, that program. That's what's going to determine whether they decide that they should talk about ex-celebrity or ex non-entity, or whoever it might be that's done something the previous day, is based on that. So the story often does break in social media, and that's a very valid strategy, and I think it's a very cost-efficient strategy as well.
So I found myself nodding to quite a bit of that, but so your question was, so is social media replacing old-school PR? Can you bypass the PR? And the answer is yes, of course you can in certain circumstances. And Adam pointed to a few of those issues. And of course, the reason that you can is because we now have our own platforms and we have our own way of disseminating. Social media is a brilliant way of getting the story out there. So it's not just a case of if you write it, they will come. If you write it, you've now got a way of getting them there. And of course, it's got to be a good thing, got to be a good story in the first place. Having said all of that, I still think and you judge it by the power of publications, and I'm not talking about old school mainstream publications, some of those still have a lot of clout, so the Daily Mail, Mail Online in the UK has a lot of clout, Guardian has a lot of clout, but there are other up-and-coming organisations and publications that have a lot of clout, like the HuffPo and BuzzFeed, etc. And you want to be in those things. So actually there's that symbiotic relationship between can you do it on your own, can you create a buzz so someone will pick it up, but actually if you can go straight to that source, then you would, of course you would.
No. Look, even, the example Adam gave, and, we go back to the John Lewis example, they're two different things, right? You do have large organisations, with investment or very large workforces can run really effective social media campaigns for very little budget, basically. The one I really like is when We Love the NHS, which was at a great time when the NHS was being criticised from the US during their Medicare debate and that kind of thing, and by creating an emblem, the NHS were able to use they're one of the biggest employers in the UK, if not the biggest employer in the UK, and able to disseminate through a variety of Twitter accounts and build up momentum that way. And that was a really good campaign, which was mostly pure social media, and they got an element of it. Think about the stuff that really you browse through social media more often than not, even with the Bat Kid one and that kind of stuff, that when that was shared with you, it was from a news article. And or even if it was from bloggers, those bloggers have been targeted by PRs or in a PR method to coordinate them. It was a video asset and a high production video asset, a news asset, a TV news asset, which got shared. So the fact that you're somehow saying that media professionals, both journalists, the idea that we bypass them in order to get social media, you can do social media campaigns, but you know what? They are expensive if you don't have a massive large workforce or a massive amount of budget in some ways to throw at it. Getting good editorial coverage is the stuff that's really shareable, because also people value it. They recognise the source, but journalists are journalists because they know what they're doing. Good journalists create good content, and that gets shared. So the journalists are the one who do more of the social media work for you. So they're the ones to hit up first.
I would just add on that. I think the journalistic third-party endorsement is clearly always going to be very, very important indeed. But actually, PR is, let's not forget what PR is, it's public relations. And public relations has changed out of all recognition as a skill set, certainly in the UK and the US over the last 4 years. That the media relations stuff is still very, very integral and an important part of that. But the way brands are using public relations to relate to their publics, their stakeholders, through social media and various other channels, has become a core part of PR.
And it's content creation. That's what mostly we're doing, and which gets seeded in different ways. So I'd agree with that, but using journalists as a platform to start that off, absolutely.
Any more questions? You're at the front.
This last year we saw a few fake stories going on Twitter, and the media start to talk about the story. So it's not like a loss of credibility when all the media want to be the first to deliver the news. What's your part on that?
Is Twitter a credible news source? Is that yeah? So last year, the question from the front, there have been last year and in recent times as well, Twitter fake stories on Twitter, stories that in the fullness of time have been discovered not to be true. What are the implications of that for social media, for brands, for journalists?
Can I go with that one first? Do you mind? The real important there has been some fake ones, and I mean there was actually something going around on BuzzFeed about the Chinese guy who was suing his wife for having ugly children, so a few people might have seen that. Now that was actually a story, and a fake story from 7 years ago, or potentially fake story, and it hasn't been questioned. The issue of fake stories spreading, yeah, it doesn't, but it's always happened that, there's been fake stories that get placed in the media, and frankly that's down to poor journalism. By them not actually doing their research, or sometimes not caring, because you know what? A journalist's job is often about getting eyeballs into a media source, into a publication, so that consumers absorb adverts, because at the end of the day, the publication has to earn money. And sorry to be so cynical about it, but that's actually one of the big things. So, yeah, that's what I'd say on that.
We've only got 15 minutes left, guys, so let's try and make the answers.
A fake story I liked was Samsung lost the case against Apple, right? The patent infringement, and apparently they paid the entire $1 billion in 5-cent pieces in a truck. They didn't know, but that was actually a published story that even now, a couple of months down the line, is still getting reshared and circulated on Facebook and Twitter, and more people discovering it. But this is a real plug for what Brian's already said is important, to have your own online newsroom, because in that situation, the first thing you'll do, if you've got any interest in it, is go and check out the Samsung or Apple newsroom and find out what really happened. So you need to know that there are certain places online where the brand is representing accurately what the situation
is. They need to be prepared for journalists.
They need to be able to rely on a trusted source.
Fake stories, it was ever thus. It was there before social media. The Sunday Times once published Hitler's diaries. They turned out not to be Hitler's diaries. The only thing I would add, the only thing that social media does, there is the opportunity that it speeds up. But as Brian says, if the journalist does their job properly, fact checks, then these things shouldn't happen. That's not to say they don't happen.
Just a quick one on me, a bit about content and engagement, I suppose. How can firms and organisations make themselves relevant and useful to journalists?
Yeah, well, John, do you want to go first? Sorry?
Yeah, again, I've touched on a bit of this. You make yourself relevant and useful by having intelligence, and by intelligence I don't mean nous, I mean by having knowledge, and that means really getting under the skin of, I've said it before, but getting under the skin of the publication, understanding its agenda, understanding the subjects it covers, understanding its take, understanding the journalist, and doing all of those things, and then you're in a much better position to be able to offer something that is relevant to that person. You might have a great story to tell, but that great story might not be relevant to that publication. So if you do all of those things, then I think you can be useful.
I go?
Okay, well, I think, just briefly, I think that as a company you need to think about your content strategy and think about what your main themes are, and you probably can't have too many. It might just be one. O2, for example, have a content strategy at the moment around data privacy and also around youth employment. They may not be known particularly strongly for either or both of those, probably more the data privacy one, but once you become an authority on a topic, then journalists are going to come to you for these kind of stories. I think that they're ones where a brand can become associated with a particular topic or theme which is quite far removed from their core product. So something like Red Bull, where they've become absolutely synonymous with extreme sports. Whatever kind of business you're in, if you know what you're going to become a specialist in and what your content strategy is, then you will be looked to by journalists or bloggers as a trusted source and a useful contributor to their story.
Being relevant and useful comes back to the point I made earlier. My job is to make a journalist's life as easy as possible. Now, lots of people think we're about, like PR people are about spin and all this kind of like dark art sort of stuff. Most of my job is about identifying facts within companies and identifying what they have to say about certain issues and getting compelling messages. So it comes down to having facts, because you know what, journalists work on facts and they also work on opinions, yeah? So actually looking and just really identifying those two simply, that's what you start off with. Those things, so you've got your facts and your messages, then you build your releases, your backgrounders, your case studies around those sorts of things, and you pull them into an area of resource for journalists, an online resource for journalists, which again goes back to being speedy. So even when there is, if there's a crisis or issue happens, you need to have planned messages for when that happens way before it even hits. If you're working on the hop and you're only dealing with the issue as it sort of turns up, you're actually not going to be doing as good a job as you would be, and not acting. In fact, you lose control if you can't be as quick as possible to respond to a journalist who's potentially threatening your reputation. So being useful, speed, but that comes from having facts and comment pre-prepared.
Any more questions on the floor? Lady at the back.
You touched on this briefly earlier, but I've come from a PR background. I'm now in marketing, and in PR we were told always phone before you email a journalist. Email is a completely dead form of communication, and that was something I never really believed in myself. That I know journalists get a lot of calls all day, but I just wanted to get an opinion from all of you on what's the best method of communication, phone or email.
I don't buy that. I don't buy that. I share your scepticism, and I suspect other people here share it as well. And it depends how you use the phone, of course, and it depends how you use email. But as I described it, and I described a good press release and a bad press release, most of those press releases I'm talking about aren't chugging through fax machines anymore, aren't coming through the post, they're coming via email. And if you use email judiciously and your timing is perfect and your pitch is perfect, then I would personally much prefer to it's more efficient in terms of my time than taking a call. And you know what, most calls I'll just let them divert to voicemail anyhow.
Build a relationship with the journalist, so it depends what your relationship is. If you have a great relationship, you might be able to call them, you might be able to tweet them. You've got to know that individual journalist. But I think play it safe at the beginning, because you don't want to get off on the wrong footing. And calling them before the email's gone there, it's the wrong way round. I think, the whole issue of should you chase when the news release has gone to them, that's your call. But, it depends on whether that journalist is good at spotting everything. They've got a tough job every day, looking through maybe 500, even 1,000 news releases, a lot of crap in there. So it is tough for them. And we heard the example from Brian earlier, sometimes a call, they might actually thank you for that if they've missed it.
They do. I was at a big agency which also was training me to do exactly the same thing, and I thought it was bonkers at the time, but that was when my earlier days. And in fact, what's the interesting thing about that strategy is that was an attempt to play it safe. That was like, I don't want to send you something, because it goes back to giving a journalist when sending stuff through and giving them whether fax or post, giving a load of stuff which they'd have to go through gunk. That's not how people use email anymore. So and phoning them up to tell them something, it takes much longer than, again, using that subject line really effectively. No, God almighty, email them first, and if they don't get... And do you know what? You've also got respect, goes back to their deadlines. They're working, and also freelancers work at all sorts of time of night, and there's more and more freelancers. You have no idea when they're actually going to be able to, talk to you. So do you know what? Email them first, and if you don't hear something back, depending on how immediate that news is, in a couple of hours or a day or two, depending on how valuable that news source is, then phone them. But again, only phone the ones where goes back to being relevant as well. Again, read the bloody publication. There's no excuse anymore. It's on the internet. Is that journalist actually writing about your stuff? And if you're pitching it and they're not, sort yourselves out.
It does make me laugh. Bear in mind, we're a PR publication, PR Moment, but we don't do news. And I get PR people ringing me up with a news story, and you hear my head falling onto the desk in disbelief. We're almost out of time. Any more questions from the floor? Say so now, or hold your peace. Okay. Well, I just have one more question.
There you
go. I missed it. Hang on.
On the point of email subject lines, do you have any do's or don'ts? It might be a bit more of an idiosyncratic thing as to what you like or don't like, but any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, clearly that example that Brian gave was on the extreme end, but I have seen that kind of thing happen where it becomes wallpaper. So you call it the name of you call it PR press release or, news from X. That's wallpaper. That just gets, your eyes glazes over and you move on to the next thing. So think about, in a sense, kind of, I half saw an SEO presentation here and they were talking about keywords and stuff. Think about what are the keywords, what are the trigger words that are going to get inside a journalist's head. So that might be around a particular subject, could be a person, it could be a theme, and keep it short and snappy and really get to the point.
Yeah, cut out all the superfluous PR fluff words like innovative, exclusive, all these sort of things like that that are just everyone's going to use. So convey the entire story in the headline, or the most important part of it. And if that's the trick, isn't it? How do you make that short enough? And if you can put a bit of magic in there as well, that's kind of going to excite and make it stand out, so much the better. But they should understand from that subject line what the basic story is, because most of the time they're going to be making the decision just on the subject line in the inbox. They won't open the email.
Yeah, I mean, we get quite a lot of praise about our emails. And you know what, it's like, and I know it sounds funny, but like, you know what, one of my employees, ex-employees, went to another agency, and met the MD of that agency, and she was like, you know what, I'm so pleased, like, he's the only one who can actually write an email, and you're like, what the how is this person still in business? But, you know, it does come down to, yeah, a bit like John using keywords. I mean, like, we have a little bit of our own secret sauce that we use in it, but it is about making sure those words, the very words, it comes down to thinking about those words. Are they going to attract that journalist to open up that email? But you know what? Subject line, that's your starter. The rest of that content, man, that's also important, you know, and how you put those together, you know. But it does come down to buzzwords, because it's got to be the things that are going to be of interest to them right then.
Okay, final question from me. Unless we've got any more from the floor? No? Okay. I say this with one eye on the earned and owned and paid for debate, but you know, how close are we to marketing professionals speaking to journalists, guys? Or is it already happening?
Marketing people hire us to talk to journalists for them because they don't have the skill set. And PR, like lots of things, I mean, whilst more marketing managers are having to do more types of things, they're actually pulling in certain specialisations because there's so many channels now, and media relations is still one of those. I mean, so we work for marketers on their behalf and do it. Are they starting to do it? You know what? To be good at PR, you actually have to have some experience and some real specific training and some talent. And often it's a different skill set. So not quite yet. And anybody can talk to a journalist. It's how you do it, and you know, whether that relationship is going to keep building. They come to us so that we're able to make sure that relationship keeps being prosperous, useful for them. They keep getting their content out.
I think the more interesting area of convergence is around content marketing, and how many PR professionals or journalists are considering whether they want to do that. So people who have got a good eye for a story, understand what makes a good story, that's a different skill set potentially to some of the skill sets that some marketers have. I'm not sure if so often marketers are being required to actually contact journalists and sell in stories. Obviously that depends whether you have an all-in-one role. Someone might be the marketing and PR manager, and they hopefully have a good broad skill set to do both of those kind of different areas.
I'm not sure if this is the best way to start answering this question, but my thoughts come from utter ignorance. Having worked as a journalist and not worked in PR and not worked in marketing, but it does strike me from looking at it from the journalist side is that the two things are converging in some ways. And actually, because you had two different disciplines in the past doesn't necessarily mean you need those two different disciplines, or at least those two things need to work very closely together. So you do get inevitably the marketing team gets that social media is yours. Well, it might be, but a lot of the disciplines that apply to PR are good things to use when you're doing social media. So my suggestion would be actually, you know, more talking together, more joining together.
Okay, great. Guys, that brings us on spot on time. It's 1:15. Didn't that fly by?
Okay.
How do I conclude that? I mean, it seems to me that the key themes really are one of relevance, timing, and keeping media and journalistic contacts relevant and targeted. I suppose if the channels, the channels that people still use the most are indeed email and Twitter. But there's no doubt if you haven't got the right content and you don't present that content in the right way, it's going to be difficult.
The website's the other channel.
And the website.
The website.
Thanks very much, guys.